Welcome everyone to this Scrip webinar on how originator companies face up to the biosimilar challenge. My name is Eleanor Malone and with me is my colleague Jessica Merrill. Scrip has been covering the evolving commercial landscape for biosimilars in different ways for many years. With so much going on in the space right now, we thought it might be interesting to share some of our insights. Just to start, a couple of housekeeping points. Jess and I will deliver our presentation and take questions at the end. During the webinar, you can enter questions into the chat box below and click Submit. Participants will receive a recording of the webinar after the event. To introduce ourselves, I'm Eleanor Malone, and I'm the European Editor-in-Chief of Informa's suite of pharma publications, which includes Scrip, Pink Sheet, In Vivo, and Generics Bulletin. I've been reporting on the pharmaceuticals industry for the best part of 20 years. Most recently, one of the more important stories I've been covering is the introduction of biosimilar adalimumab in Europe. I'll let Jess introduce herself.
Hey everybody, I'm Jessica Merrill. I'm a senior editor at Informa. You'll be able to tell I'm the one talking because of my lovelier American accent. I've been reporting on biopharma for the Pink Sheet and Scrip, and I've been covering the sector for about 15 years, based in New York. I'm focused on our commercial news coverage, so new drug launches, M&A, and business strategies, and pricing issues. And lately I've been covering a lot about biosimilars, as the first round of biosimilars have hit the U.S. market. Slide issue here.
Okay, we're on overview. So just to give you an overview of what we intend to cover, we'll start by outlining the key originator companies and the key biologic brands that are on the front line of biosimilar competition. We'll then take a deeper dive into the extent of the exposure for some of those companies. Then we'll examine one by one the kind of defense tactics that companies can employ as major biological drugs face loss of market exclusivity. We'll consider the market in the US and also the European market. And then we'll take questions from participants. So to start with, those on the front line. Here we see the key companies with the most to lose to biosimilar competition. From AbbVie, that must contend with sales erosion for the drug that brings in about 2/3 of its revenues, to Amgen with a basket of biologicals at risk, to Roche and its blockbuster cancer medicines, and also Johnson & Johnson with Remicade, and Sanofi and Lilly with insulin products. Now last year, a RAND Corporation report estimated that biosimilars would reduce direct spending on biological drugs by $54 billion in the US from 2017 to 2026. This table shows the key products that have lost or will soon lose exclusivity to biosimilar competitors. Now you can see that collectively these products had sales of nearly $70 billion in 2017. In short, there's a lot at stake. And as you can see, the majority of these product sales are in the US, which accounted for 63% in total versus 20% for the EU. In terms of companies, AbbVie's Humira is the biggest selling product facing biosimilar competition. But Roche has the largest exposure as a company with Mabthera, Rituxan, and Herceptin and Avastin. And Amgen, as we said before, is also notable for having a number of blockbuster products at risk, including Enbrel, Neulasta, Epogen, and Neupogen. Jess, do you want to take over?
Sure. So, first off, we're going to be taking a little bit of a closer look at these four firms: Amgen, AbbVie, Johnson & Johnson, and Roche, all of which will be facing a lot of pressure from biosimilars. They each market monoclonal antibodies for inflammatory conditions and cancer that will face biosimilar competition if they aren't already. In some cases, some have already been facing biosimilar competition in Europe for many years now. So turning first to Amgen, this is a company that is facing biosimilar threats on multiple fronts, including from products representing a total of more than $13 billion in 2017 revenues. The erythropoietin product Epogen was one of the first to face biosimilar competition in Europe, while the neutropenia drug Neupogen was one of the first of Amgen's products to face biosimilars in the U.S. as well as Europe. There are now several biosimilars against these drugs. Enbrel continues to be patent protected in the U.S., putting off biosimilar competition possibly into the late 2020s, while the first biosimilar version of Neulasta just launched this summer in the U.S. And we actually got some breaking news this morning that Pfizer announced it is going to be launching Remicade. It's a version of Epogen and Procrit now. So it's going to be at a 33.5% discount to the cost of Epogen and 57% off the cost of Procrit. So that's another impact for Amgen to face. So Amgen has several strategies in place to confront the challenge. It's building its own portfolio of biosimilars to counterbalance the competition. So for example, the company's first biosimilar, Amgen-Vita, a version of Humira, is launching now in Europe. And a second product, a copycat Avastin, has been approved in the US and EU, though it's not yet launched. Amgen is also relying on lifecycle management strategies to extend the life of its brands. For example, ahead of the launch of biosimilar Neulasta products, Amgen transitioned some of the market to a new Onpro version, which is an on-body auto-injector. So the company successfully transitioned more than half of the market for pegfilgrastim to Onpro. Here's another look at sort of Amgen's risk versus growth outlook. So while by 2025, Amgen will have lost $6.2 billion in annual sales compared to 2017 for the products exposed to biosimilars, our market forecast group, Data Monitor Healthcare, forecasts it will have made up a lot of the lost ground, about $4.6 billion in sales from three key biosimilars, the Humira version, Avastin, and another one, Herceptin, which has been approved in Europe, but which received a complete response letter in the U.S. this June. It will also have generated more growth from newer, innovative medicines, so offsetting that biosimilar threat. Okay, and now turning to J&J, this is quite a different example where the pressure is really on just one product, but it's J&J's top-selling drug, Remicade. In Europe, where Merck is a partner, Remicade has lost significant market share, particularly in countries that operate national tenders where the winner takes all, like Nordic states, for example, where biosimilars now account for almost all infliximab usage. But European sales of Remicade are a small proportion of the total, and in the U.S., J&J has been much more successful in defending its turf, at least when it comes to volume share. J&J has retained a 93% volume share of the infliximab market despite the entry of two biosimilars. But the company's had to offer steep price concessions to retain that level of share, which has impacted sales. I think sales were down about 18% in the Q3, or maybe for the 9 months. So the company, J&J, is forecasting similar outlook for 2019, so they expect this trend to continue. And many of the company's other biologics, like Stelara, still retain market exclusivity for several more years. And Procrit is also now will be impacted, but is a smaller product for J&J. Okay, Ellie?
Here we go. So AbbVie. Now, AbbVie has the biggest single product exposure to biosimilars with Humira, and Humira accounts for 65% of the company's revenues. In Europe, Humira's patent estate has just fallen with the simultaneous launch of biosimilars from a clutch of rivals. And the dynamic in Europe is being watched very closely. In some ways, it can be viewed as a proxy war, since the bulk of the revenues are generated in the US. European markets operate differently, so it's hard to read through to the US, but it's been suggested that AbbVie will try and restrict patient usage of biosimilars in Europe as much as it can, even if it means massively undercutting its own pricing. And the reason it would try and do that is that it wants to reduce the amount of data that biosimilar makers will be able to build up to support their US launches. However, I mean, that might be slightly unrealistic because it's unlikely to have complete success in such an area, because some large European markets operate systems that ensure contracts are shared between multiple tenderers. In the US, AbbVie has signed settlement deals with biosimilar makers, and they have called off patent litigation and agreed to stay off the US market until a series of progressive dates of 2023. However, not everyone has signed up to this. For example, Boehringer Ingelheim says it intends to launch in the US before 2023, although it's yet to indicate exactly when it will do so and why it thinks that it's going to be able to win on the patent front where other companies have bowed. So moving on to Roche. Roche's trio of high-performing anti-cancer monoclonal antibodies has served it really well for many years, but the advent of biosimilars presents a serious challenge. And the impact is being felt now, even if delays in some biosimilars gaining US approval have set back the arrival of Rituxan biosimilars to next year, despite it losing patent protection this year. Still, all three products will face mounting biosimilar competition in 2018 and 2019. Also, the EU market for Herceptin represents a sizable chunk of the product sales, meaning that sales will take a big hit this year, and that's in contrast to products like Humira, where it's a much greater proportion of sales coming from the US. One unknown for Roche, particularly in the US, is how patients and prescribers will react to biosimilars for cancer, where there's no room for uncertainty in the treatment regimen, and prescribers might lean towards the brands they're most comfortable with in the near term. We've seen the company launch new products that will help make up the losses, such as Ocrevus for multiple sclerosis, and that's its most successful launch ever, and Hemlibra for haemophilia. It's also signing a lot of deals to keep its R&D at the cutting edge, whether that be through access to next-generation immunotherapy products, as exemplified by its $5 billion deal with Affimed, or through paradigm-shifting acquisitions like those of Flatiron Health and Foundation Medicine, which it hopes will help it stay at the forefront of new frontiers in and personalized medicine. So having looked at the companies and the products, let's take a deeper dive into the tactics originator firms can employ to minimize damage to their business. First up is the patent thicket. Now, AbbVie exemplifies this biologic defense tactic with its vast armory of IP around Humira. The company has thus far resisted biosimilar incursion in the US market by progressively signing those settlement agreements, as I mentioned just now, with major biosimilar challengers, which gives them staggered access to the market from 2023. And there's something of an incentive there to settle early, to get earlier access to the market. In Europe, the situation is different, and the first biosimilars were launched last month, but this is a far smaller market, as we said. Sales of Humira were $12.4 billion in the US last year, compared with $4.1 billion in the EU. And then information on the patent estate around biologicals is less clear in the US than for small molecule drugs, and meaning that it's much more difficult and daunting for biosimilar makers to negotiate that patent thicket. And that can incentivize them to sign settlement deals, keeping them off the market for years, rather than facing prolonged and costly litigation. And also this gives them at least certainty on the launch timelines and enables them to plan more easily. So I'd say that building and defending one's patent estate is the first line of defense for biological originator companies, and this activity has successfully pushed back expectations on biosimilar launch timings.
Okay. So rebating is one tactic. So what Johnson & Johnson is doing with Remicade is perhaps the strongest example of how innovators are rebating to defend against biosimilars. J&J has effectively blocked biosimilars from the market by offering payers steep rebates, and in some cases tying those rebates to the exclusion of biosimilars on formulary or to other products, which is known as bundling. The high volume of a product like Remicade makes it hard for payers to say no to the exclusive contract when they're getting branded infliximab at a lower cost anyway. Even if a biosimilar offers a higher rebate, the low volumes of a new product have a much smaller impact on the budget. Pfizer's filed a lawsuit against J&J alleging its contracts are anti-competitive because they were exclusionary. So the outcome of that lawsuit could inform future rebating strategies involving biosimilars. And this whole issue of the rebate wall, as it's known, isn't anything really new. It's been commonplace in the brand space in the U.S., but now we're also seeing it used in biosimilars and also some complex generics like Copaxone, which also face some similar challenges. So the question is, why should payers give preferred access to a biosimilar when they can secure the high-volume branded product at a lower cost anyhow? Or is that short-sighted, and do they have a role to play in fostering the early biosimilar market? The situation is different in Europe, where some governments have strict policies in place to ensure that uptake is faster and more comprehensive. In some markets, all or nearly all infliximab patients are on a biosimilar, and as a whole, branded Remicade has lost more than half of its market share. Okay. So here's another, I think my slides have gotten a little bit off, but another defensive technique, which is lifecycle management. Amgen's work with Neulasta is a good example, where they transition patients to the Onpro on-body injector, which I mentioned earlier. So by providing this device that enables the administration of Neulasta at home 72 hours after chemotherapy, the product offers valuable patient convenience and reduced hospital burden over the original Neulasta, which gives it an edge over biosimilars. Amgen reported that it converted 63% of Neulasta to Onpro device at the third quarter in the U.S. So while this tactic worked quite well in the branded segment, there are questions about how it will hold up as more biosimilars launch, and ultimately it could come down to contracting in the end as going forward. So Mylan has launched one biosimilar, Fulphila, and another biosimilar of Neulasta is coming out from Coherus by the end of the year, Udenyca, I believe. So that's going to be interesting to see how it develops. Along the same lines, another tactic is the launch of subcutaneous versions of intravenous biologics. For example, Roche is defending Herceptin with more convenient subcutaneous administration that saves time and cost elsewhere in the health system, thereby reducing the appeal of the biosimilar, which is intravenous, like the original Herceptin. And then another important tactic is this idea of the value adds, like patient support programs and copay assistance. And this is something Mylan's talked a lot about with the launch of Fulphila, how important it is to be offering those same sort of services as the brand.
Okay, we're moving on to defense tactics number 3, or maybe it's 4. I want to just reiterate that the slides will be distributed to all participants at the end of the call. Anyway, so several companies have adopted the if you can't beat them, join them tactic. This is where you become a biosimilar maker yourself. Amgen, as a strong originator of biological therapies, is now positioning itself also as a biosimilar maker, and in many ways that's going to help make up the lost sales, as we saw on an earlier slide. Pfizer is another company competing on both sides of the fence. Having Sandoz in its stable means that Novartis is also has a stake in the biosimilars market, and there are others like Biogen and Merck & Co., which have set up partnerships to develop and sell biosimilars. And then there's Boehringer Ingelheim of Germany, which is another big pharma company that has a stake in the biosimilars market. Then there's if you can't beat them, join them part 2. This is compete on price. Just a couple of weeks ago, AbbVie won the first tender for adalimumab in the EU, we understand. It looks like it raced biosimilar makers to the bottom to keep Humira's place on the market by offering an 80% discount. That sounds staggering, but we're hearing that it still leaves AbbVie with a handsome margin, since it's able to make Humira for less than 5% of its current selling price. Then this tactic I've called weaponizing patients, which is perhaps a rather loaded term. But what I mean by it is targeting existing patients to resist biosimilars. So, for example, J&J is running an anti-switching campaign aimed at Remicade patients, and it's using emotive patient video interviews on how the drugs changed their lives. It also provides key points for patients to discuss with their doctors, and quite frankly, it looks a lot like propaganda against biosimilars. Other companies have similar campaigns targeting patients. These campaigns are probably working for now, although biosimilar makers are urging US regulators to act against such tactics. For example, by calling for public information campaigns on biosimilars and calling for originator companies to be required to make clarifications about biosimilars so that patients aren't left to infer that they're inferior.
Okay, so this is probably the most outstanding approach to handling biosimilar threats, and that's innovation. Aside from the bristling IP thicket around Humira, AbbVie is hoping new drugs like the oral JAK1 inhibitor, ubedesitinib, will become a multi-billion-dollar selling drug by the time Humira has to share the market with biosimilar rivals, which is likely looking to be about 2023 right now. So companies are trying to outdo current bestsellers to preserve their hard-won market positions. J&J is building up Stelara and Tremfya to offer newer, better treatments as Remicade faces biosimilar competition.
So here's just a summary of those principal tactics available to originator companies defending a product from biosimilar incursion. Some of these won't work in all territories. For example, direct-to-consumer campaigns for specific products are not allowed in the EU. Let's move on to discuss the two different geographies in more detail. Yes.
Okay, great. So now the US and Europe represent two very different landscapes when it comes to biosimilars. In Europe, biosimilars have a longer history, and there are multiple biosimilars available against a variety of different original biologics. I think the count is somewhere above 50. The first biosimilar to be approved was Sandoz's somatropin biosimilar, Omnitrope, in 2006. The first biosimilar to win approval in the U.S., on the other hand, was Sandoz's filgrastim biosimilar, Zarzio, in 2015. In the U.S., the regulatory pathways were developed much later, and the market's been slower to take off, driven by patent restrictions, the heterogeneous payer environment, and other factors, some of which we've talked about. So FDA has approved more than a dozen biosimilars, but about half that number have launched, held up by patent challenges. And it looks like we're going to have about 7 on the market shortly now that Pfizer's announced the Remicade launch, and Coherus is also planning to launch a Neulasta biosimilar by the end of the year. So I'm going to start off talking about the U.S., and Ellie will talk more about Europe. So here's a little slide we have that looks at how not that long ago U.S. payers had really high hopes about biosimilars in the U.S. market and how they could be used to help lower drug spending. And we have a couple of quotes we're going to put up here. Ellie?
Yeah, I was on mute for a moment. So the couple of quotes are from early last year and late 2016, so a couple of years ago. They were showing how payers viewed biosimilars as an important component of the market. And we have here Tim Wentworth, the CEO of Express Scrip Holdings, saying, while they may not be interchangeable, biosimilars will be delivered to patients who today are on the branded product. And the second one is from David Denton, the CFO of CVS Healthcare, who said biosimilars are being included as a component of our 2017 standard formulary strategy, replacing higher cost drugs.
Ellie, did we lose you? Okay, so from those two quotes anyway, apologies there, it's clear that payers have talked bullishly about using biosimilars to rein in U.S. drug spending, but the reality has been a bit different, And U.S. payers have initially taken, in some cases, a short-term rebate win over the longer-term goal of fostering the market for the long term. So for some insurers, they've been resistant to give biosimilars preferred formulary access, accepting steep discounts from branded manufacturers instead. And then on the other hand, some payers, meanwhile, argue that the biosimilar discounts thus far just haven't been big enough to move the needle. And actually, with some of the newer launches now that we're seeing in the U.S. market, the discounts are a little bit steeper than the first wave. It looks about like 33%. So while in the U.S. there's still limited commercial experience with biosimilars, the success of initial launches has been quite varied. On the one hand, there's Remicade and the situation that we talked about there with the innovators blocking out the biosimilar, and biosimilars have only secured about 7% market share 2 years post-launch. But on the other hand, there's Amgen's Neupogen, where branded filgrastim only holds about a 37% volume share 3 years post-launch. Aside from the rebating issue, there are other factors that can impact the success of a biosimilar. So Remicade, for example, is a chronic medication that patients build a relationship with, and given the lack of interchangeability in the U.S., the market's really only open to new prescriptions, as physicians aren't likely to switch patients who are doing well on Remicade to a biosimilar. So it's a much smaller market initially. And Neupogen, on the other hand, is an acute treatment, so there's a steady flow of new treatments, and it's administered in a cancer care setting in which patients often don't even know what product they're receiving. And the next launch we're going to be watching very closely is going to be the launch of Neulasta. So insulin is an interesting category, and I put it in here just to be clear. In the U.S., insulins are not currently categorized as biosimilars, but FDA is in the process of recategorizing insulins as biologics beginning in 2020, and given their complex nature and their categorization in Europe, I think it is sort of representative of the biosimilar market. So this is a category in which patients are in desperate need of cheaper alternatives. And there's at least one biosimilar that's had considerable success. Eli Lilly launched a version of Sanofi's long-acting insulin Lantus, insulin glargine, in 2016, which has become a growth driver for Lilly. The product, Basaglar, has been preferred on formularies in some cases over Lantus. In the first 9 months of 2018, it generated $569 million in sales, so representing a fairly successful commercial launch for a biosimilar. But then, interestingly, Merck recently announced that it's not going to be commercializing its biosimilar version of insulin glargine, called Luzdana, after a market assessment, and they cited the pricing and cost of manufacturing as the reason why. So this was a bit of a surprising development, given the strength of Basaglar, the fact that Luzdana was already tentatively approved by FDA, meaning it was approved pending patent litigation resolution. So while others are also developing biosimilar versions of Lantus, including Mylan, for now the market's largely left to two leading diabetes players. So this could be a bit of a disappointment to some patients. So the big question now is enthusiasm for biosimilars waning in the U.S.? And if so, what impact could that have on the development of the next generation of biosimilar products? We have seen some examples that are notable. Mylan, for example, which has invested heavily in biosimilars and complex generics, that is exploring strategic alternatives earlier this year because its stock is undervalued. Momenta recently announced that it would stop biosimilar development to prioritize novel branded drugs, with management citing a lack of clear path to value creation for biosimilars. I mentioned Merck's announcement on the biosimilar Lantus, though the company has said it is committed to biosimilars and is not backing out of the space. And then more recently, Novartis announced that Sandoz won't develop biosimilar rituximab in the U.S. after receiving a complete response letter from FDA. And I'm going to hand that over to Eleanor to talk a little bit more specifically about that situation.
Yeah, sure. So one of our colleagues, Alex Shimmings, met Vas Narasimhan, the CEO of Sandoz's parent company, Novartis, and asked him about the decision to give up on biosimilar rituximab in the US. And I'm just going to extract some of the things he said. He said that biosimilars has been a tale of two continents. In Europe, it's been extraordinarily successful. It's been where we've had great launches. We've had a broad portfolio. Most of the uptake is faster than we would have expected. It's very easy at this point to get approval and launch and rapidly get to the market. But on the other hand, the US is very complex, almost a product-by-product adventure, he called it. We announced that we're not going to pursue rituximab because the FDA has asked for another trial, and that's been an interesting experience because we're approved in Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, and a bunch of other countries. But in the US, they wanted additional data. So he pointed out that they're approved with biosimilar Humira and biosimilar Enbrel in the US, but in both of those instances, they have an IP landscape to negotiate and courts to negotiate. He also said other instances are focused on rebate walls, so there's a lot of work to do still in the US. He said, though, that he thought there was a lot of goodwill among all policymakers who agree it could reduce a lot of waste, but it's looking to be a few more years before the opportunity fully materialized.
Okay. So that's sort of the big question right now when it comes to the U.S. market. And we have a few questions right now. A few quotes here we put up right now. This is one from an interview I did last year with Kaiser's pharmacy contracting leader, where he said, if the U.S. market is not able to produce movement to the biosimilars and generate a return for those manufacturers that have gone down this biosimilar pathway and invested in those molecules, I think they will just realize over time that they have to close up shop and move on. America would have missed a very significant opportunity. So Kaiser is one of the first payers to be proactive about including Inflectra, the biosimilar of Remicade, on its formulary in place of Remicade. This is a quote from FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, who was speaking earlier this year to insurers at the U.S. Insurers of America Health Insurance Plan Policy Conference. He said, do they continue to benefit from monopoly rents today or help generate a vibrant biosimilar market that can help reset biologic pricing and drug pricing more generally through competition? These are binary choices. You can't have your cake, or in this case, your rebates, and a vibrant market for biosimilar competition too. But then, just to represent sort of the other side of the story, here's Amgen's former commercial head, Tony Hooper, who's actually recently left the company. But he was talking about the experience that Amgen's seen with Neupogen. And he said, some of our competitors and public officials have made statements that the U.S. biosimilar market is not working. We have a different point of view. The fact that a biosimilar now holds the majority share of filgrastim segment less than 3 years post-launch proves that biosimilars can find a meaningful place in the U.S. market, just as they have in Europe. So ultimately, the $54 billion in potential savings to the U.S. healthcare system that could come from biosimilars from 2017 to 2026 is just probably too hard to ignore. It may just take more time than some expected for the market to form in the U.S. And especially now that we're starting to see a few more launches, we'll get some more experience before we can rush to any sort of judgment. There was a mixed assessment. Some of these quotes are from the Association for Accessible Medicines Generics Biosimilar Conference in September, where we had some of our reporters. And there was sort of a mixed assessment there about the obstacles to multi-source biologics could be too big of a hurdle and prevent biosimilars from gaining a foothold in the U.S. And then on the other hand, a lot of other people were saying that it's just too early and that the experience in Europe will ultimately play out in the U.S. The next bellwether is the launch of biosimilar Neulasta. So Mylan launched Fulphila in July, pricing aggressively lower versus the brand at a 33% discount. And it's expected to have a stronger launch trajectory than some drugs like Inflectra, given some of the factors we talked about around the category and the way supportive cancer care drugs are administered. And now another pegfilgrastim biosimilar from Coherus will be launching later this year, so it should be interesting to see the pricing dynamics. That one so far is going to be priced on par with Fulphila, and then there's additional discounts and things that are negotiated. So Ellie's going to pick up with Europe.
Yeah, moving on to Europe. So Europe has a broader, longer experience with biosimilars. There are more than 50 biosimilars available in Europe, covering multiple molecules and competing products. Also in Europe, there's a diversity of market types. So there may be less revenue to defend in the first place, but European sales are where originator firms are seeing a much bigger hit upon loss of exclusivity of key biologics. As we mentioned before, recent reports suggest that AbbVie has underbid biosimilar makers in a tender in an undisclosed European territory. While it's reportedly dropped its price by 80% there, AbbVie's CEO Rick Gonzalez has said that the company is looking at discounts of 10 to 80% across Europe. So, you know, you can't just say it's Europe. There's a great deal of variety there. Now, although most medicines in the EU are approved centrally, it's for the national agencies to make their own rules about biosimilar interchangeability or substitution. In general, European authorities are more open to switching than the US, and some, such as Denmark, actually mandate it. And unlike in the US, where there is considerable and effective resistance to moving existing patients from originator anti-TNF antibodies to biosimilars, in Europe, several countries have policies aimed at achieving that end. For example, the NHS England aims to have 80% of all existing patients being treated with the best value biologic within 12 months of a biosimilar launch. Nevertheless, automatic substitution isn't permitted in the UK, and the switch must be decided by the physician. And we've also seen that patient groups are moving towards supporting biosimilar use because they can see that there's a possibility it will expand the availability of biologic medicines to more patients who currently aren't actually receiving them. So with the growing implementation of non-medical switches to biosimilars in Europe, by which I mean switches motivated by price, there's a growing body of real-world evidence on the safety and efficacy of the practice. Although there is a dearth of large, properly powered studies with long-term data and immunogenicity information, and there's a lack of data on the effects of multiple switching, but you know, we're getting there. It's worth noting that particularly in Central and Eastern European states, the availability of new biosimilars can actually dramatically increase patient uptake of certain classes of biologics. So, despite the challenges, originator companies facing biosimilar competition in Europe still have commercial prospects worth fighting for. And some markets are easier than others. For example, important markets like the UK, Germany, and France conduct multi-winner tender offers, or they have subnational tendering systems at hospital or regional level, which include criteria other than price. Established originator firms can afford to cut price, but they may also have an edge when it comes to other factors that are considered in the tenders, such as what they can offer in physician education, patient or physician support, logistics, inventory management, the delivery device is a factor, the mode of administration, excipients, or even the environmental impact of their production. A recent article in our sister publication, In Vivo, highlighted that some patients in England are started on biosimilar trastuzumab, for which the originator is Roche's anti-cancer Herceptin, but then they are sent home with a prescription for Roche's own subcutaneous version, which is still under patent protection. And that's because that subcutaneous version is cheaper to administer than the intravenous version. As always, companies need to identify where they can offer true value. And when it comes to the savings that biosimilars have brought, there might be an opportunity also for originator firms to benefit from broader, earlier use of biologics. So while accessing markets for first-line use may be tougher, there might be new chances to drive adoption of their newer therapies in later lines of treatment, just by the mere fact of this kind of broadening general use of biologics in Europe. So to recap, the most interesting thing to watch in the European biosimilar space right now is the unfolding situation for Humira or adalimumab. AbbVie booked $4.4 billion in European revenues, and at least 4 biosimilars have already launched to compete for a piece of that. They're listed there. As we mentioned earlier, it looks like AbbVie is going to go in aggressively on price to defend its territory. And it's just won that undisclosed tender for 80% discount. I'll hand over to Jess to wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, so in closing, just some final conclusions. Biosimilars will take their place even in the U.S., so it will be driven by European markets. Some at the starting line may not stay the course, but Big Pharma's presence in biosimilars could bring credibility to the market, and ultimately maybe there will be fewer players, but they'll be successful. The speed and the magnitude of price and market share erosion may be less painful for originators than some originally thought, but eventually biosimilar uptake is needed if global healthcare systems are going to be able to afford pharma's next wave of innovative launches. This is, after all, the pact that pharma has made with the public. And I think with that, we are going to be able to take some questions. So, Ellie, do you want to go over how the question Q&A works in terms of, or did we already do that?
No, so that's the end of the slideshow. We'll just take a moment to have a look at the questions that have come in and decide which ones we can answer immediately, which ones we need to follow up on. Jess, there's a question here on, is FDA doing anything on the policy front to encourage biosimilar uptake in the US? Do you want to have a look?
Why am I the one that has to answer that question? Just kidding.
You're over there.
I don't cover the policy side of the business as much. We do have a whole team in Washington, D.C. That's on top of all those updates. But I do know, obviously, yes, this is a big issue. FDA, as probably many of you know, held a big hearing on biosimilars back in September, looking at actions that could be taken to encourage biosimilar competition. And I think finalizing guidance on interchangeability is certainly one of the things that stakeholders, well, biosimilar manufacturers, are eager to see. And also enhancing public education efforts around biosimilars, or maybe some more of these tactics to cut back on any misinformation about biosimilars. And just on the interchangeability issue, FDA released the draft guidance, I believe, in January last year. And I think some sponsors were hoping to see more flexibility on the design and endpoints of clinical switching studies. And so there's still a lot there that's being talked about. A lot of people at this hearing spoke about that. And then there's this whole other issue about how impactful interchangeability might actually be. I think it would still be quite impactful, but as many stakeholders have pointed out, it has some limitations when it comes to biologics because only 10% of biologics are around that are distributed at retail pharmacies where automatic substitution currently occurs. And then on the idea of amplifying education initiatives around biosimilars, and just another point that popped into my mind is that Pfizer filed a citizen petition with FDA earlier this year, back in August, requesting the agency issue guidance on truthful and non-misleading communications about biosimilars. And that was citing some things that have been out there from some brand innovators sort of raising information about the difference between biosimilars and the brand. And then just on another note too, HHS is also looking at rebate reform, and that could be coming out any time. It's sort of up in the air right now, but that could have some implications for biosimilars too when it comes to this whole rebating issue. All right, I didn't have any time to look at any questions while I did that, Eleanor, so hopefully you do.
There's a question here. Do you know any biosimilar company is developing Onpro per se? Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I would imagine that as a delivery device system, it's probably patented, and so the biosimilar companies won't be able to market something identical, but they may be looking at their own delivery devices because I believe that the rules allow for different delivery devices. And in fact, on that whole question of biosimilar makers making their products attractive, We've got companies like Celltrion is developing a subcutaneous version of J&J's Remicade, which Remicade itself is not available in that subcutaneous version. So as well as biosimilars, there are biobetters, which cover kind of mode of administration as well as devices. But no, so the question is a biosimilar company developing Onpro per se? I'm not aware of it. It couldn't launch while there's patent coverage of Onpro device anyway. Do you have anything to add to that, Jess?
No, I think it's a great question, something to look into and follow up on. There's a question here about the 80% discount on Humira by AbbVie. Is that rumor or actual fact? And that is, I believe, actual fact that AbbVie confirmed in their third quarter sales and earnings call, although I don't think that they've disclosed the market that was in, and it's thought to be probably one of the smaller Nordic markets. They also talked about a really wide range of discounts across Europe that they're looking at. I think they said ranging from 10% to 80%, so that's still really up in the air, but they did actually change their forecast for Humira erosion for next year. Eleanor, do you have the figures on that? I think it was going to be higher erosion.
It was higher, and I don't know if I should kind of say when I'm not absolutely sure, but to my understanding, it was initially forecast to be less than 20%, and it's now up sort of 20 to 27%. 26,
yeah, 26 to 28, I was going to say, so something like that.
Yeah, so anyway, it's going to be higher.
Okay.
What about this one? What's the status of Pfizer's lawsuit against J&J?
Oh, well, I'm not 100% sure of any of the most recent actions, but I know that in August, the court rejected J&J's motion to dismiss the lawsuit, so it's moving forward, and the court agreed Pfizer had sufficient information to show injury, so it's sort of wait and see as far as I know right now in terms of what comes next.
Yeah. On the question here, I would like to know any biosimilar company that launched Humira in the top 5 EU countries. Now, this is still a developing situation, but we do know that a number of companies announced they were launching immediately, and that's in one of the slides here. Let me just scroll back. Sorry. Do you remember which slide it was in? Okay, we'll perhaps have to come back to you on that. But I mean, a number of 5 companies have already launched.
Biogen, right? Amgen are 2.
Yeah. Boehringer Ingelheim not doing so. It's not going on the European market right now. Tell you what, I'll look for that answer, and we'll take another question. Are there any early indications of how new Neulasta biosimilar is performing in the US?
Well, I think it's still really early, and Mylan hasn't given out any sales yet, but I think Facila does seem to be off to a decent start. So I think Mylan said that Facila had an 8% market share, and that's just of the pre-filled syringe segment, which is just a smaller portion of the overall Neulasta market segment currently. But I think that's viewed pretty favorably for such early days. And I know that Leerink just recently lowered forecasts for Neulasta and raised forecasts for Facila based on that launch trajectory. So it seems to be encouraging, and of course it's obviously going to be something to keep a close tab on over the next year, especially now that Coherus is launching this other product, Udenyca. That's all I know about that. But I'll be watching it closely, certainly.
On that European Humira launch question, we've brought up the slides, I think, now. So it's Sandoz with Hyrimoz, Samsung, Bioepis, and Biogen in partnership on Imraldi, Amgen's Amgevita, and Mylan, Fujifilm, Kyowa Kirin's Hulio, and there should be some more coming.
Here's a question just about Lucentis, how to assess attempts to develop Lucentis biosimilars with the perspective that Avastin is a really economical alternative. But I don't know. I still think a Lucentis biosimilar, I'm just talking off my gut here. I don't really have any insight other than, what I know about those two drugs. But I think a Lucentis biosimilar that's priced lower would still be really valuable. Just because of the on-label indication, and then also these newer brands that are going to be launching in the eye category from Regeneron and Novartis are both developing sort of next-generation drugs. So I think cheaper alternatives to those would be really welcome. Let's see. Well, this is an interesting question someone has. So I've heard biosimilars in the U.S. are not always discounted heavily, so they're not seen as inferior. Any suggestions on how to combat that way of thinking? I've actually never heard that. So I think that's sort of interesting. And I don't think that payers would see it that way. I mean, I find it hard to believe, they wouldn't be educated up on this enough to, sort of understand the difference between biosimilars. I mean, unless that's thinking about from the physician perspective, but I don't know. That's just a sort of interesting question. But I haven't ever heard it. I've never heard that.
Okay, and there's a question here. On what basis are biosimilars approved in the EU and the US? How is this expected to change? It's a very broad question. And basically in the EU, the biosimilar pathway was available much sooner, so we've had products like the growth factors, insulin, filgrastim around for much longer. It's the case that in the US the burden of proof is higher, would you say, Jess? I mean, something like the Sandoz rituximab shows that the call for data is higher in the US. We've seen a number of products rejected in the US that have been approved in the EU.
Right, and I think there's another. There was another example. Oh, the Herceptin. I think Amgen's Herceptin version as well. So yeah, I think that has been a big issue.
Also, some products have been approved before there was a biosimilar pathway, or they've chosen for one or another reason not to use that pathway. So, for example, some of the insulin products were not actually approved via the biosimilar route in the EU. Jeff, can you speak to that? I think you had a slide.
What?
Yeah.
What did you say?
You had a slide on the insulin situation. The insulin's approved separately and the different pathway.
Oh, yeah. And so, insulin has been much more widely available, right, as a biosimilar in Europe than in the U.S., where right now there's sort of only this one example. So, yeah, and then FDA is rebranding all of insulin right now, which has even innovative brands, which has been a whole nother issue that's going on and has pros and cons, I guess, that our policy team has been covering. But certainly, how many patent-related cases are going for Humira? We're a biosimilar company involved. So, so far, almost all of them have settled for the 2023 that we know of. 5 or 6? I could get back about this question with the exact pretty easily, as we've been covering all of the patent cases. I know there's the one with Momenta that's outstanding, and I'm not sure of what else is, but someone on our team, Brenda Sandberg, has been covering this really in depth in terms of legal cases. So we could get back with the facts on that.
Yeah. There's a question, what's the most common way for originators to differentiate from biosimilars? I think that really depends on the product and the market, the type of product, the type of, prescription route. I don't know the answer kind of objectively. I assume that things like brand recognition is important, particularly in the States. I think sort of the lack of education around biosimilars right now in the United States
gives the brand just a much bigger upper hand. And the question is, is there going to be some campaign to educate the public and physicians more about biosimilars? Some of the manufacturers, the leaders in the biosimilar manufacturing space that I've talked to, say they're not ready to do DTC advertising. It just doesn't make sense with the cost. So in that case, that's where brands really could have an upper hand, I would say.
Yeah, and then obviously it's very different in Europe because they're not able to advertise directly to patients. If it's going to come down to a tender like it has done with Humira, then it's going to be questions of price and the other points that we raised about whatever criteria are laid out in the individual tenders, then they probably have a strong position in some of those, like the logistical side of things.
All right. It looks like we've gone through all of the questions.
Yeah.
And the slides are going to be provided, which is one question. So those will be sent out after. And this has been great. It was a really timely topic and obviously important to everyone working in this space, both innovators and biosimilar manufacturers. And thank you, everyone, for your time. Eleanor, any last minute comments?
No, that's it. It's been great to have everyone. It's been interesting to read the questions, and I hope you all found it useful. Thank you. We'll send out the recording as well as the slides, by the way.
Great.